Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Thursday, February 20th, 2025. I am John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Not media commentary columnist, social commentary columnist Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John.
And Washington commentary columnist Matthew Continetti. Hi, Matt.
Hi, John.
Well, we come to you on a terrible, unspeakable day, the release of 4 dead hostages by Hamas in 4 apparently locked coffins as a sort of final joke. Coffins to which the Hamas handed the Israelis, or the Red Cross handed the Israelis, the keys, and the keys don't work. So as of this moment, as I'm speaking to you, the coffins have not yet been opened to make sure that the bodies inside are, in fact, the bodies of an 80-year-old man and a 32-year-old woman and her 2 very small children. The bibuses are the mother and the 2 children, of course, the Bibus family. And I want to begin just by reading, he is not here today, but our fellow panelist and commentary senior editor Seth Mendel's post from 2 days ago called "The Meaning of Kfir Bibus," when it became clear that the bibuses were dead and were coming out in coffins. If Hamas's statement is true, this week will bring a tragic, though not unexpected, close to a painful episode, the fate of the rest of the Bibus family. Yarden Bibus was released this month by Hamas after nearly 500 days in captivity, and the terror group is claiming it will soon deliver the bodies of his wife Shiri and 2 sons, Ariel and Kfir. Ariel was 4 when he was taken on October 7th, 2023, and Kfir was 9 months old. To be Jewish has meant experiencing a crushing disappointment in the world since the Hamas attacks that started this war. A stray line in one of the many articles about the Bibus family today, meaning Tuesday this week, unintentionally offers a crystal clear explanation for that disappointment. For many Israelis, the New York Times writes, the story of the Bibus family has become a symbol of the brutality of the Hamas-led October 7th attack. That sentence is accurate, but in another universe, one where the international community cares a whit for justice and human decency, the sentence would read this way: for everyone, the story of the Bibus family has become a symbol of the brutality of the Hamas-led October 7th attack. In such a world, the faces of the Bibus children would be everywhere at all times. In the world in which we live, by contrast, posters with those faces get torn down from bulletin boards. In the kind of world we hope to deserve to inhabit, no children's charity or NGO would go a day without drawing attention to Kfir and Ariel and the monsters who stole them. The crimes against the Bibus family are indeed the symbol of the anti-civilizational menace that is Hamas, but also of the cowardice of the political and cultural leaders of the enlightened West. Yes, we should be ashamed of our fellow Americans who not only won't mention the Bibus family, but won't even learn the name of a single American hostage held in Gaza throughout the war. At last year's Oscars, a line of pro-Palestine stars, Mark Ruffalo, Billie Eilish, Ava DuVernay, and others, wore a pin of red right hand that is meant to valorize the murders of Jews. In a just world, all those celebrities would instead be using their time on the red carpet to do anything at all, other than express public sympathy for the Bibus children's kidnappers. It shouldn't only be Jews who see Kfir Bibus' smiling face and bright red hair when they close their eyes. In that famous picture of baby Bibus, he is holding a small pink stuffed elephant. Kfir's relatives spent over a year searching the rubble of Nir Oz, the kibbutz where the family lived, for that pink elephant. It turned up finally in January in what his aunt hoped would be a good sign. As the pro-Palestinian mobs fill the streets of every major city to celebrate Hamas's slaughter, Jews around the world have looked at them dumbfounded. They kidnapped a baby. How much does one have to hate Jews to side with the monsters who kidnap babies? A lot is the answer. An unpleasant realization Jews came to over the past 16 months. Kfir's face became a symbol of the conflict because it represented a line that had been crossed and cannot be uncrossed. Members of Congress giddily attended Tentifada demonstrations that were no longer simply pro-Palestine or anti-colonial. They were about defending those who stole Kfir from his home and dragged him to Gaza, where, according to Hamas, he died. And it is impossible for the rest of us to pretend that we didn't see a chunk of society whether in person or online, rushed across that line and cheer the people who kidnapped a baby. Kfir became a symbol because he is the answer to every relevant question about this conflict. His case is the war boiled down to its essence. Kfir is the dividing line. In a better world, there'd be no one standing on the wrong side of it. So that's Seth Mandel's The Meaning of Kfir Bibus. I struggle to discern a larger meaning, except to say that when a populace, as is the case in Gaza today, dances around, not only celebrates, but dances around the coffins of a 4-year-old and a 9-month-old, or
well,
however
it was Gazan civilians who took them initially. So this is actually something I think needs to be, the public needs to be reminded of this, because we're still hearing this, oh, the Gaza civilians, we have to protect them. They eagerly participated in the taking of this family and the children. They hid them in their homes, holding them hostage. And we know from the surveys of the streets of Gaza, they were absolutely enthusiastic about Hamas and what Hamas has done. This is no longer just an issue of, a poor beleaguered refugee people being controlled by a terrible terrorist organization. They were all in. And I think the story of this family, this tragedy, shows that. They showed civilians taking them away, walking them out of their homes, never to be seen alive again.
That's very well put. And it has an effect on how we should be thinking about the Trump proposal to depopulate Gaza, to raise its buildings and to rebuild it from the ground up with the population relocated. As we've said here, as many people have said, this idea that this is a form of ethnic cleansing is comic in some fundamental sense, because wars that are launched from a territory, the losers in those wars do not dictate the terms of their national identities any longer. They sought territorial advance in the form of the invasion of Israel. As Dan Sino reminded us on Monday on the podcast, the actual plan here was not just simply to do a one-off, September 11th, blow up 4 buildings, and then, although of course they also wanted to decapitate the presidency and the political system of the United States, but was actually to invade, to move north through Israel, and potentially to meet Hamas, which would be moving down from the north to the south in Tel Aviv. That was actually the vision of October 7th, which was not supposed to end with them retreating back to Gaza and then getting the stuffing kicked out of them for 16 months. This was an invasion by a foreign entity. They're going to lose. And when they lose, the concerns over where they go is really not something that we should care all that much about. Populations have been relocated and moved around throughout the 20th century, even now, as a result of wars. And
before we get to that point, we have to consider what might happen with phase 2 of this ceasefire. The release of the bodies today is supposed to be followed by the release of live captives in a couple of days. And in fact, the living captives who are to be released will fulfill Hamas's obligation under the agreed to prisoner list of phase 1. And that raises the question of what happens under phase 2 of the deal. And there are some mixed signals, funnily enough, coming from this administration and from the Middle East. Steve Witkoff, the special envoy for the Middle East, has said that phase 2 will happen, and he's going to try to make it happen. The Hamas, apparently, in a report from the Times of Israel, is floating the idea of releasing all the captives, all the remaining captives who are male soldiers, including Americans, in exchange for complete withdrawal. That's a non-starter, it seems, from the Israeli side. And Trump, of course, is on record saying that Hamas should have released all the captives last Saturday, or all hell will break loose. So Mara Gaza is out there on the horizon, but I think the more immediate question is, what is going to happen after this weekend? And will the war resume? Will there be some kind of liminal space here where there are negotiations over whether we get another phased release of captives or what? Or does everything break down and people forget? The worst outcome would be people forget about what Hamas did on October 7th and why Hamas needs to be destroyed.
I think I just want to say, from Hamas's standpoint, but my guess is they start playing for time. They start saying that they can't proceed quite yet because there's this violation or someone said that. They try to slow down, draw out this whole process, as they've done.
Well, so phase 2 and phase 3, I will actually read you phase 2, the words in the, if I can find them, excuse me, in the agreement. Second stage, very short. Second stage, just like the first stage, supposed to last 42 days. Quote, announcing the return of sustainable, calm cessation of military and hostile operations, and it's taking effect before the exchange of detainees and prisoners between the two sides. All remaining Israeli men alike, civilians and soldiers, in exchange for an agreed-upon number of prisoners in Israeli prisons and detainees in detention camps by Israeli forces, and the complete withdrawal of Israeli forces from the Gaza Strip. So phase 2 is essentially what Israel agreed to is phase 2, if it proceeds, is a continuation of a ceasefire that is accompanied by a withdrawal of Israeli forces from the Gaza Strip and the sustainable calm. So Sunday, Israel is going to have to make a decision. What they can say is there is no sustainable calm. You have reaped the whirlwind upon yourself, particularly with what happened today, parading our dead children like they were, like this was a Philadelphia after the Super Bowl. There is no sustainable calm. You're evil. We're done. We got out who we can get out. We have no faith that we're going to get anybody else out. We're going back in. The Israeli public is very, very divided on this. Ask a poll question. Poll question says 70% of Israelis want all the hostages back more than they want the resumption of the war. On the other hand, it is very possible that the Netanyahu government will fall if the war does not resume. There has been this suspended period of 6 weeks in which this political trouble that the coalition is in has been kind of frozen in place for the most part. The populace is divided. The question is, will Israelis believe that it is a fantasy to continue dealing with Hamas, or that the cost of seeming to allow Hamas to dictate the terms under which this war concludes? Yeah. Go ahead.
My thought on that is the non-starter is complete withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. Netanyahu's not going to do that. And it would be foolish for him to do that. There needs to be a buffer zone. That buffer zone needs to be in the Strip. So forces need to be ringing the perimeter of the Strip inside Gaza in order to prevent and deter another October 7th. We've had all these discussions about the Philadelphia corridor between Israel and Egypt. The IDF needs to have some presence there in order to prevent the smuggling of weapons and funds into the Gaza Strip. So if I had to take a guess, Netanyahu's play might be to negotiate over that part, right? We're not going to leave, but maybe there's something else that can be done in order to create the conditions for further release of the hostages. And I think that's what Witkoff, the U.S. envoy, will be pressuring him to do, because everything we hear from Witkoff is he agrees with the public, the Israeli public, that section of which wants the hostages back, prioritizes the release of the captives ahead of the destruction of Hamas. But I think whatever happens, and I'm just, sitting in my study speculating as usual, whatever happens is it's going to be this kind of gray zone for the coming weeks where we don't know what happened. And what does Hamas do? Does it take a provocative action? Does it kill one of the hostages in order to prove its mettle? That, I think, makes for a very combustible situation, only adding on to not only the domestic concerns, but something we haven't talked about that much, at least on the podcast I've been on, which is this mounting crisis in relations between Israel and Egypt. These armor divisions that Egypt has been staging outside the Gaza Strip in Sinai. Egypt is saying it's there to stop the Palestinians, but there's no question that the relationship between General Sisi and Israel has deteriorated. The relationship between General Sisi and the United States has deteriorated over the Mara Gaza plan. We're all exerting this energy of past week about Europe and about Ukraine. That's important too. But it seems to me that the Middle East is going to rear its ugly head at any moment once again.
This is one of these interesting sort of contingent moments in history. Choices are going to have to be made here that are not obvious or deliberate in either direction. Netanyahu is an extraordinarily cautious and prudent player. This is something, as we have said constantly, people misunderstand. They think he's some kind of a zealot, raging extremist type. And in fact, he moves with great trepidation and caution. Dan Senor's podcast with Yoav Gallant that we talked about on Monday reveals that Gallant, who is otherwise kind of dovish in certain ways as a military man, oddly dovish, had a much more aggressive plan in some aspects than Netanyahu did at the beginning of the war, and was refused, was told that his plan could not go into. That is Netanyahu to a T. He had a green light to unleash hell last week and didn't do it. He also doesn't know what to do about the hostages. Right now, today in Egypt, there is a meeting to discuss phase 2. And I assume the American position is release all the hostages on Saturday or on Sunday or whatever, and we'll take it from there. We'll see what kind of survival Hamas can achieve in the wake of that. Bibi has said, regardless of what happens, Hamas cannot be allowed to survive, period. These may be unbridgeable. This may be an unbridgeable chasm. Witkoff, because he's the negotiator, wants to declare a victory for the United States in securing the release of the hostages, since there are American hostages still there. The question is, at what point do the Israelis say we cannot sacrifice our future, however monstrously tragic this is, to ensure the release of these people, because we're now talking about tens of thousands of Israelis in the future who will die if we follow the logic of the ceasefire agreement to its end, which is that Hamas will somehow survive to fight another day, that the message will be that if you take Israelis hostage, they may beat the crap out of you for a while, but that their emotional connection to their own people means that you have a whip hand over them. And who knows what that information will do to other nations and other countries, and what the mythology that will spread, or that Hamas will spread if it survives, what that will do to other actors, not even just them.
Well, everything
what
we
if
know
Iran
about
decides to somehow fly a plane into Israel, kidnap 100 people, fly them back to Iran? I don't know how that would happen, but and then hold them in Iran so that Israel doesn't ever do anything to Iran. Anyway, Christine.
Well, this is everything we know about the history of terrorism, and the West and the United States dealing with terrorists says just that. You actually do have to destroy them. I mean, I'm recalling President Obama talking about ISIS being a JV team. Well, that did not prove correct, and we did not actually eliminate a terrorist cell when we had the opportunity. It will rebuild, it will come back, and allowing even a semblance of Hamas to continue to have any influence in the region does in fact tell both its terrorist regime sponsor in Iran and every other budding terrorist network in the world that is exactly what you do. And this is where the impatience of the Trump foreign policy approach, both in the Middle East and in Europe, yields some unfortunate destabilizing results, because there's no one saying that on the Trump side. There's talk of, leveling Gaza, but saying Hamas has to be destroyed, and that is the beginning of our negotiation process. The rush there, I know some people claim that's a strategy, but it's not helpful when you're talking about,
removing the Palestinians from Gaza and not allowing them to return implies that Hamas would not have a base anymore.
But that's also
kind of embedded in what Trump is saying on this particular subject.
But that also speaks to a sort of a different universe. We're not in that universe yet. In this one, it's true. He's not talking about destroying Gaza. Saying all hell will break loose, and I'm not going to say what that means, is actually a way of dodging being specific about saying terrorist organizations must be destroyed to the last man.
Look, his vagueness is part of his strategy, and he says very extreme things without following them up with specifics, and that's you might say an opening gambit or a negotiating strategy, or simply the way that he thinks, like the details will be filled in later. I'm not sure that the United States, what matters here with the United States is he's saying, it's up to you. You know what, Bibi? It's up to you. You want to go destroy Hamas?
We're supplying the weapons that Biden denied the Israelis.
Exactly. But you want to, you decide as a sovereign nation, not that he's that thrilled with other sovereign nations, but you want to decide as a sovereign nation that this is in your national interest. You go right ahead. That is the policy of the President of the United States as far as we know it.
And that's how we got out of the contradiction between his statement last week that all of the hostages need to be released or hell would break loose, and what Netanyahu settled for, which was simply the continuance of the agreed phase 1 of the ceasefire. Right. Trump said, whatever Israel decides.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how he's granting Israel the room to
agency,
the ability to act in its own national interest.
Right. So
not to say that I do agree with Abe and Christine that there's a larger question looming here, which is what to do about Iran. And what's become clear over the last 72 hours or so is that the White House foreign policy is being run by people who have an extremely non-interventionist, dovish attitude toward the world, and believe that the first step should be reaching agreements with adversary powers, even if we don't have leverage over those adversary powers. So I do think Trump may try to open some type of negotiations with Iran in the coming months. And even as I will say, he did reimpose maximum pressure on its economy and was crowing about the fact that there have been mass blackouts in Iran over the past week. That would not be helpful to anyone if we enter another endless diplomatic process with Iran, where clearly they'll be cheating and using whatever sanctions relief they get to sow havoc and terror around the world.
And this, of course, represents if your scenario works out the way that it works out, this will represent one of the greatest missed opportunities in modern history. Iran is naked before the world. It has no defenses that we know of, air defenses or any defenses of that sort. It is still very active with its nuclear program. It is the position of the United States that it cannot be permitted to get a nuclear weapon. It has been a destabilizing force against Israel in the Persian Gulf, in the Red Sea, activating the Houthis
it's killed Americans for decades.
Killed Americans for decades, and they are an open shot with very little cost to whoever might take the shot. And
I'm not saying the Doves will win necessarily. I just want to put that out there, that this is a debate that I think is happening. And I do, when you look at what Secretary Rubio said during his visit to Israel last weekend, it was extremely powerful condemnation of Iran. And I think President Trump, begins with the fact that Iran is trying to have him killed, and he understands that. I remember there was that moment in the White House, in the Oval Office, God knows, time is a flat circle now, a week or so ago, where he said, he's left instructions to obliterate Iran in the case of his assassination. So, if anything, and I'm sure we'll transition to Europe in a moment here, but if anything, what's happening in Europe may be something of a diversion from a more aggressive posture that the administration is pursuing toward Iran, even if that means ultimately that if Israel decides to launch an attack in the coming months on this defenseless Iran, on its nuclear facilities, on the nuclear infrastructure, simply to delay,
on its oil platforms,
simply to weaken Iran further, move back the timeline for an Iranian nuclear weapon years, perhaps create political instability, which we already know is always beneath the surface in Iran. If Israel does that, I do think we're in a position where, at the minimum, the Trump administration would provide rhetorical cover and diplomatic support when the United Nations attempts to expel Israel or something like that as a result of this attack.
Well, one thing we know about the Trump administration, both the first one and this one, is that consistency is not its hallmark, that it is expostulating a view of the world in relation to Ukraine does not mean that view of the world doesn't end at the borders of Ukraine and Russia. It may well end there, and that he may be incredibly aggressive elsewhere. We don't know. He does not have a record of being militarily aggressive. He's done one shots, taken out Soleimani, hit Syria in 2017, but
he hit Somalia. Early in this term.
But these are one shots. They're like one night operations. You go in, you go out, you're done. It's like going to Wisconsin, as Bill Murray would say in Stripes.
Day trip.
That's the day trip, right? And so we're talking here about sustained military action and the
though it is interesting, though, isn't it, that Israel was able to accomplish so much in one raid last October.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember the interviews, maybe it was Dan Senor even on our podcast, talking about how or John Chanzer on our podcast, talking about how some of the IAF pilots got home for breakfast after destroying the Iranian air defense system.
Yeah.
By the way, a Russian-produced air defense system. Right. They destroyed it, and they took out some other facilities, particularly the ones involved in creating the mechanics of ballistic missiles, just to communicate to the regime what they're up to. So we talk about sustained engagement. It's not clear to me actually how sustained it would need to be, even.
Right.
A couple days. Yeah. You could set the Iranian nuclear program back.
But even decades. His goals, right? But even his goals when using military action have been very restricted. Like he really
doesn't like using it, which is unusual for a fascist.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
I read in Esquire magazine yesterday that, we're living in the Third Reich. But one difference seems to me is that this is a fascist dictator who loathes military force. And all he wants to do is end wars and cut our defense budget.
I think the key to his not wanting any sustained operations is that he wants to be able to say there's peace while he is in office. So it's all, the result is that it's all very short-sighted.
Right.
We can end this war in a day. Well, it's always easy to end a war in a day if you cave to the aggressor.
Well, it's it's a huge temptation for these presidents, particularly say a term-limited president. I mean, what was Obama's strategy with Iran? I know he started it, but by the time we got to the Iranian nuclear deal, what was the strategy? I'm kicking the can down the road. What does that mean? That means I want to get praise for making some kind of deal that stabilizes things right now. And then I leave, and then I sign my $40 million book deal, and I make movies for Netflix, and I issue my year-end top 10 book list, and do whatever it is I do. And then the world can go hang because I've let this. I also was in a position to do something to destroy the nuclear aims of this irredentist regime that history would regard my actions as something really decisive. And I decided not to do it because it's too much trouble and I don't really know that I'm worried about the downsides. And this temptation, which is to say, I'm only here for a while and it's too risky. And I let the next guy, I'll going to deal with the things as they are right now and let the next guy deal with the ramifications or the consequences. That's,
But this is always this is the debate that I think we all have been having since Trump won re-election about his foreign policy approach, because you either have to see that he's very presentist. It's why he's announcing his foreign policy on Twitter generally. And Abe is absolutely right to talk about him not concerned about the long term. The reason I think he has written out plans that Iran should be obliterated if he is attacked doesn't suggest that he would do the same thing if an American was taken hostage by the Iranian regime, right? It's very personal for him. And that personal deal-making approach, is it strategic? Perhaps in the moment. Is it long-term? Is it thoughtful long-term about how power works on the globe? That remains to be seen. Now, it is certainly in stark contrast to the, Anthony Blinken, Joe Biden way, which we have, I think, correctly criticized for years. But it's very unnerving, I think, to our allies, as we've been talking about with regard to Ukraine and Europe. I think in part because it isn't long-term and strategic in its thinking. Now, are there people in the administration doing that kind of thinking? I hope so. But I would like to know who they are and what they see the axis of power, particularly the Russia-Iran connection, which nobody in Trump world wants to talk about because we're making this deal evidently with Russia. I'm just curious if there are strategic long-term thinkers that Trump has brought on that we're just not hearing from.
Look, because I just want to add that just because he wants to act in ways that change the facts on the ground in the short term doesn't mean it doesn't have long-term consequences.
No,
there is a long-term effect of what he's up to regarding Putin and Ukraine, and there is a long-term effect. It's in limbo regarding this hostage deal.
Trump does not believe in allies. I think we can say this now as a fact. Like you just said, our allies are unnerved, our allies in Europe. He does not believe in allies. He believes in personal friendships. He's willing to say, look, this guy's my friend. I like him. I like Muriel Bowser, the mayor of DC. I like Zelensky.
He says he likes G.
I like G. I like him. He likes Kim Jong-un, who is like one of the three worst people who has ever existed on this planet, practically. I mean, he likes people, or he doesn't like people. There are plenty of people he doesn't like, and he makes no bones about that. None of that obliges him or the United States to anything. That's part of the message that he's sending to Europe, to Canada, to places like that, which is, I don't care about maintaining our alliance or having an alliance. And there are ways in which this is, I think, absolutely
he doesn't
harmful.
care if we're not getting anything out of it.
What he thinks we're not getting out of it.
All about what we're getting out of the relationship.
But that's by his definition of what it means to get something out of it. I think we get plenty out of NATO. He doesn't think so because he
thinks the allies are bilking us.
Well, that's why his approach.
We're not getting paid. We're not getting paid. They're not
I'm
paying
saying so.
enough.
He has that right, but I think this is
monarchical, not fascist in that regard. Like in terms of foreign policy, it's very much like I'm surprised he didn't try to marry one of his daughters off to a foreign power's son. I mean,
well, that's why he's trying to get the rare earth deal, right?
That's exactly right, Abe. Right. Yeah. That's the source of what's been going on
with him and Ukraine. Rare earth is with Ukraine, right?
Yes, Besant went to Ukraine, presented this deal. We only have the sketchy understanding of what's in it, but essentially it was Ukraine would allow the United States not only investment in Ukrainian commodities, mining industry, but royalties and licenses paid off the commodity production within Ukraine in perpetuity, it seems. And this is Trump's way of thinking, okay, we've given this $100+ billion in military and economic and social aid. What do we get out of it? And Zelensky didn't sign it because Zelensky says that it didn't include the security guarantees he would like. And this set off, I think, Trump. And then I'm not saying any of this is right. I just want to tell this narrative. Zelensky did make things worse by responding to Trump by saying that he lives in the disinformation space. And if there's just one thing we know about Trump, when you criticize him, he will then go back and criticize you even more. So that's how we've gotten to the point now in this pretty remarkable breakdown of the U.S.-Ukraine relationship and all of its implications for the American presence in Europe and the NATO alliance. It starts from this position that Trump views the world in completely transactional terms. And you're right, it's kind of monarchical because it's basically like, what are you doing for me/us economically? And then maybe we'll provide you some things. And just one final point. It's interesting to me that Trump understands leverage, political leverage, unlike really any other leader. Maybe Nancy Pelosi, actually, is the only politician who I think understands leverage in the same way Trump does. But Trump exercises leverage over America's allies. He understands that we have this military leverage. He understands we have this economic leverage because of the power of our economy. And so he's willing to use it in order to get what he wants out of our allies. But I just wish he tried to look for places where we could build up leverage over our enemies. And right now, it doesn't seem like we're entering this process with Russia from a position of strength. Instead, we're exercising leverage over Ukraine.
Well, this is the key, and this is actually the irony of Trump seeing himself and wanting to see himself as this deal maker who knows how to make a better deal than anyone else. If you're making a good deal, if you're the principal in a deal making, situation, you know when to shut your mouth and let the underlings work out the details. And he doesn't do that. He's got to be involved at every single level. He's got to make these insults, which actually wreck the deal. It's very juvenile, actually. And if he's gonna, and he's doing the easy path of bullying allies rather than, as you say, Matt, taking out Russia is our enemy in many ways. He doesn't treat him like an enemy because of this personal, again, I keep saying monarchical, but it's like a king negotiating with another king, and the underlings' opinions and the people will just benefit from our wisdom. But he's got to work out the details, and the devil is in the details with a lot of these negotiations.
I think that if you don't have allies or you don't believe in alliances, you also don't believe in enemies, really. Right. I mean, Trump has personal enemies, power. But the personal enemies that he has are the people who threaten him personally, right? Jack Smith is his enemy. Alvin Bragg is his enemy. Biden Tish James. But I mean, he has somebody who's on the other side of a real estate negotiation and gets a building site that he wants is his enemy. In the world of global affairs, He does not view Putin as an enemy. He does not view Xi as an enemy. He doesn't think about it in those terms because the threats that they pose are conditional. They're in the future. They involve thinking things through to a third or fourth level, where if you do X, and then that means, not to
and
use
they're on the
classic
periphery.
chess. Right.
It's Ukraine is far away. That's the always
we
says.
have an
the
ocean. We have the
Taiwan.
ocean.
Taiwan is the little pencil above my desk that is China. It's far away. Why do I care?
Right.
And this is what I worry that we're heading toward is Yalta 2, where Trump, Xi, and Putin sit in this summit and basically
divide the planet up.
They divide the planet. Trump just says, "Okay, Putin, you have your near abroad, and Europe's going to be on its own. They're going to have to figure out a way to get their affairs in order if they want to deter you. Xi, you have your near abroad. That's Taiwan. We're going to figure out some way where we can move TSMC. That's a semiconductor manufacturer that's based in Taiwan. Basically, we want to move it to the United States. We want to take back, right? We want to take back our chips industry that they stole from us. This is Trump's language. And then you're going to take care of it. And I'm going to remove the troops from South Korea. I like Japan. Japan is like the one country along with Israel. They're the two countries he really likes. But we'll figure out something with Japan. But really, that's going to be yours. And I'm not that interested in it. I want the Western Hemisphere, specifically North America, Greenland. That's what we're going to do. That would be a pretty amazing moment. And I do think it would have very dire consequences for American security, empowering these two dictatorships who do not have our interests in mind at all.
And by the way, I mean, if you actually play that out, like, is it not, if you were writing speculative fiction,
right,
and you wanted to play this out,
it could happen in May. It's not that speculative because
right. But I'm saying what happens over 20 years in a world in which we effectively divide up the planet into spheres of influence. It's not a joke. I mean, I'm sort of thinking this through. Like, Australia is a very wealthy country that has not had to really think all that much about its own defense. China essentially gets control of the Pacific.
It's
and
already
the South Pacific.
Infiltrating Australia.
Right.
You look
It's
at what's
infiltrating
happening
Australia, and Australia will have to remilitarize. Japan will have to go. Japan will have to go nuclear, which has been, it's like an axiom that they don't want to go nuclear. Japan will have to become.
South Korea might go nuclear.
Right. That's what I'm saying. We could look 25 years down the road at a world in which we have
hyperproliferation.
15 or 20 hyperproliferation. Like that is
and
part of the reason that we want to destroy the Iranian nuclear program is so that Saudi Arabia doesn't feel like it has to go nuclear. That was where 20 years ago, that was where all this started, when people like my father and others said, we have to go after Iran, because that is where the consensus that only the 7 or whatever countries in the world who have nuclear weapons should retain nuclear weapons, because you can't trust a world in which nuclear weapons polarizes, a world in which nuclear war becomes thinkable. Trump, Xi, and Putin sitting around dividing the planet up means that, our children are going to wake up in 2060 with 25 or 30 countries having armed themselves to the teeth,
and a greater likelihood of conventional conflict. Because if you say like, one thing I've been reading is this proposal. Again, I don't know if any of this is real or not. I mean, I guess that doesn't make me a very responsible journalist, but this is a podcast. This idea that somehow we're floating as part of the peace talks with Russia, that we're going to remove our troops from the nations that joined NATO since the end of the Cold War. Okay. That means that Poland, say, we talked about this on the podcast the other day, Poland will continue to militarize, but without America playing a deterrent part and being involved, and the forward deployment of our troops are a sign of America's nuclear power. All right, our incredible economic military power, strategic power. Without that there, then the likelihood that Russia resumes its war in Ukraine or bullies the Baltic states or fights with Poland over, Kaliningrad, some type of land bridge, is extremely high. So it doesn't make for a better world, dividing this up into spheres of influence. And it's and just finally, it is a 180-degree reversal from the first Trump term, where he did have voices and he did listen to the voices in his administration who are saying, well, look, we understand the way you view the world, but let's try to also understand the importance of these relationships, the importance of America's global basing system, what the benefit of America's deterrent. Trump plussed up the defense budget in his first term, and now I'm reading that the Hegseth Pentagon is going to pursue 8% annual defense cuts for the next 5 years. Left unclear is they say they're going to reallocate that money to Trump-aligned priorities, but I don't know whether those priorities are in the Pentagon or they're going to be somewhere else at the border. And the border is important, and Trump has done a lot in that in his first month. But these decisions that are being made now as a result of this ascendant ideology that, John, you spoke about the other night, are going to have lasting consequences. And they're unknown, but history tells us they're bad.
Right. I mean, and again, he doesn't believe in our allies or our alliances. And there are ways in which there are positives can come from that. For example, let's say that Biden had come into office and had said, yes, I'm restoring normalcy and we love you. These are our friends and NATO is the greatest thing ever. But you know what? 5%. You should contribute 5% of your budgets to the military, to military matters. President Trump was right. Actually, you guys have been, you've been allowing us to support your domestic social welfare system, and we're kind of done with that. We love you. We love you, and we're with you, and we're here, and this is to save NATO. Of course, he didn't do that. Anything that Trump did, he was going to be the negative reverse polarity image of. And then Ukraine happened, and suddenly all these countries feeling alarmed start announcing that they are going to increase their defense budgets by massive amounts. And I'm not even sure that most of them have held to it since, right? Germany was going to increase their defense budget by $100 billion a year. I don't know if it's still doing that.
Germany and Canada are the laggards.
Right. Okay. So, but I think what's interesting is that Trump offered an opportunity for a rebalancing of NATO within an admiring, friendly Pacific structure that was said, we all need to be doing more. We are not, we've done this for 80 years. So he didn't do that. So we're now back at sort of square one with the Europeans and Trump saying, "Yeah, you're all a bunch of freeloaders," and they're saying, "We're so offended by you. How dare you talk to us this way?"
I'm sorry to interrupt, but this is actually where temperament and leadership matter, and where Trump is a disaster. Because you know what he's not saying? He's not explaining. He's not even bothering to explain to the American people that this is a strategy that will make the world safer down the line. Again, short-term thinking. He says, "I'm making a good deal because they've been screwing us." That is a very different approach to leadership. And in a weird way, it's like the funhouse mirror image of the absolute disaster that was the Biden foreign policy, which was, we will placate you. We think you're important, but we don't really want to do anything. And we don't want to commit American power. We're fearful of using American power. The opposite is Trump thinking he's using American power, but not for the safety of America, not to make the world a safer place for Americans. It's to make a good deal. And for the history books to say, look at the deal I made. And temperamentally, whether that's in fact what long term will happen, it is not that's in fact why I don't think Europe is so much offended as they are alarmed. I mean, if you listen to what European leaders are saying and our allies are saying, it's a deal is all well and good, but what about the long-term strategy?
They have no right to be alarmed. I mean,
they might not.
I am so annoyed at them.
The temperamental approach that he has taken is.
They've had 30 plus years since the end of the Cold War to get serious about this. They've had, as John just pointed out, they've had 10 years of the Trump era to get serious about this. They've had 3 years of the Ukraine war to get serious about this. And what's their response? The response is, J.D. Vance, you're so rude talking about the problems in our countries. Oh, what are you going to do? Abandon us? Leave us? I mean, they're coming across as dependent welfare cases, and they need to show some spirit here. I'm sorry, and just finally, I do think Keir Starmer, the Labour Prime Minister, he is kind of trying to assert himself, and he's coming apparently to the United States next week to meet with Trump and to propose, here's what we want to do, here's an idea. That's something. Otherwise, just sitting around complaining about how J.D. Vance is rude to you doesn't get you anything with me.
That's the deal that we agreed to, though. It's not like, this is we
agreed to that deal 80 years ago. You have to, well, you have to renew and revitalize. And the other people in the deal have to show something as well, right? I mean,
that's totally fine. But we thought we were getting something out of it. If we suddenly decide we want things on different terms, then the terms have changed. But
that's not entirely fair, because I'm not an admirer of the way Trump is handling NATO. I want to make that clear. However, this is what I know from the end of the Cold War, which is that so NATO countries are committed to spending 2% of their GDP on defense, and they don't do it. And then there are meetings at Davos and at the World Economic Forum and all that, and they're like, we know we're supposed to. And then everybody laughs and they all have shrimp cocktail. And then they take selfies with each other in front of a Swiss mountain. Like, the idea was, we all know you're not living up to your end of the bargain, but like, we're all friends. It's like I know I owe you. I know I borrowed $15,000 from you, and I owe you the money. But you're a billionaire. You don't really need the money back. And that for some reason, forever the billionaire, in this case Trump, not America necessarily, has this burr in his saddle, because it's like, you should pay me back the $15,000. I know I don't need it. I don't really need it. But why aren't you paying me back? And it has been an axiom of the people who believe in the international world order as it stands, that America is supposed to give, and other countries give less. And then they, by the way, are perfectly free. I mean, this is where I'm with Matt a little bit. They are perfectly free to talk all kinds of crap about America and its political system and what's wrong with it, and our guns, and how we're too violent. And the entire, intelligentsia of Europe exists in this relation to the United States as a kind of kvetching, finger-wagging, impotent, Statler and Waldorf sitting in the balcony talking about how bad we are. And at some point, that's got to stop, or that's got to end. Then a vulgarian is going to come along and say, I'm sorry, but give me my money back, or I'm going to give me my money back, or I'm going to break your legs.
I completely understand that, and I agree. But what I'm saying is, we partook in this, in their welching, essentially, on the deal, right, for a good long while. And it's not like that's what the main thrust of Vance's harangue was about. It was about their internal practices and their internal policies, and their inability to listen to dissenting voices, and so on. So I don't know. I just don't think the two are necessarily connected. I just want to say one more point about this in terms of Trump and national security, because Matt's got me thinking about this Yalta 2 thing. The way he would sell this, I mean, again, with semi-speculative fiction land here, but his idea is, well, we have the oceans, right? So this is fine for our security. It may be bad for Australia's, and it may be bad for Poland's and for whoever. What does that have to do with us? And there's a lot of Americans who feel that way.
Absolutely.
Because we've been so long since we've gotten pulled in, against our will into
on the electrical grid. Like this is
It'll be 25 years since September 11th next year.
Right.
25 years.
But there are attacks on the homeland that don't require a military or even a drone. They literally, the Chinese have infiltrated so many. Our water purification systems, our electrical grid, they could turn this country, the homeland, into chaos almost overnight if they have the capabilities that some people who assess these things on the regular fear they might already have, and that we have been extremely derelict in our duty to protect at home.
Right. Well, that's exactly right.
Sorry, I sound hysterical. You're not fiction, so I'm trying to gain this.
You are not hysterical, and that is
there's
why
a Japanese novel that's been written about this scenario somewhere, Christine.
But that is why we still have enemies. So I'm saying that Trump wants to believe that there's no such a transaction can be with a friend or with an enemy. It doesn't matter as long as the transaction itself is solid. And there are people you can't deal with, and Putin is one of them, by the way. I mean, we've had now almost 25 years of his dictatorship, with Matt's, 5 presidents getting fleeced, seriatim by him, and still continuing to seek the same result. And part of the thing that happens in deal making is that you say, well, you can't make a deal with that guy. He'll run away with your deposit or something like that. And you can when you do that with your friends, as I say, you can, like, it's bad friendship. Some of the Europeans are not really the best friends of the United States. We're really good friends to them, and they're not that good friends to us. But they also
they're
matter
forgetting
less.
their wallet when you take them out to dinner. That's the problem.
Exactly,
right?
but
you like them. They're good company, but they forgot their wallet when the bill goes.
They matter less. And what's important about them is the collective nature of the NATO alliance. It's not any one given individual member of NATO, but this idea that we group together like-minded countries to keep Pacific, this place on Earth that was the source of 100 million deaths just last century in the form of unnecessary and monstrous wars that, basically almost destroyed the entire world. And we needed to do something to make sure that didn't happen again. This was the solution, and it's been astoundingly successful. And yeah, I think Abe's right. You muck with it at your own peril. And and the scenario that I laid out, or that, Matt is talking about Yalta 2, or Christine's talking about, you have Yalta 2, and that's all great. Congratulations, we have spheres of influence. Oh, but China doesn't really believe in that. It's only going with that in effect to get its sphere of influence. It'll be perfectly happy to start stealing every penny from every transaction.
The reason we have
banks,
have the Western Alliance, which also includes Japan and South Korea and Australia and New Zealand, is in order to push the strategic boundaries of Western values and democracy as far away from us as possible. Right. Which include
rule of law, understandable,
contracts,
respecting the sanctity of contracts and
individual rights.
And not intervene. And so things like that, which of course China and Russia and the countries that we would be dealing with here don't, and they would not be beholden to them.
If you have, it's interesting to me to think about this analogy, because of course Yalta 1 was a hate object for the American right for much of its history, because this is where FDR supposedly betrayed Eastern Europe, gave Eastern Europe to Stalin, and created the captive nations, which lived under the Russian boot, the Soviet boot, for decades. At China, the big debate after World War II and after the communist victory in the Chinese Civil War in 1949 was who lost China to the communists. Right. And the American right loved Taiwan and Chiang Kai-shek.
You were a historian.
Yeah. Right.
you're also, here's what's interesting to me. So you're a historian, you know all this history, even though you're 43 years old. J.D. Vance is 40 years old. So he's also should be a student of history and whatever, and very intelligent, and went to Yale Law School.
He doesn't like it. He thinks it ruined. He thinks it ruined it ruined our country. It ruined Middletown, Ohio. It sent him to Iraq for a war that he doesn't believe in anymore. And so he's done with it. And this is what I've been trying to say on the podcast. Trump doesn't like it either. He doesn't understand what we got out of it or what he got out of it.
Right. But that's my point, which is he doesn't understand, and Vance doesn't understand, and the American people used to understand. And the problem is, of course, that we've had this 35 years since the end of the Cold War. And we've had the difficulties that we faced in the 21st century. And they want to act as though the lessons of 1945 onward that America learned to its great sorrow and pain, and the world learned to its great sorrow and pain, and then triumphed, don't matter. But they do, and those lessons remain in place because history repeats itself, and we will be back there. We got to stop here. So
we'll be back there
tomorrow. We'll be back here tomorrow to say the same things. It's no exit.
There will be more tweets, though.
Yeah, no, it's the Seinfeld jail. We're in where it's we're sitting in the jail together at the end of Seinfeld, repeating the hilarious things that we did throughout the 9 seasons of Seinfeld. An ending that many people hated and I thought was absolutely genius. So, but this is our end. So for Christine, Matt, and Abe, I'm John Bonhoritz. Keep the candle burning.